Welcome to the Kentucky History Channel, where we strive to bring you all the Kentucky history content you want and you deserve. Kentucky is a part of all of us, and we plan on covering all the history we can, from Pike County to Fulton County, from Louisville to Harlan. Here on our YouTube channel, you can find many videos dedicated to different events, people, governors, and places in Kentucky. There's something for everybody. While you're here, if you like the channel, hit the subscribe button and the notification button so you get notified anytime new Kentucky history is available. And if you want to support the channel, we have a Patreon page as well, or patreon.com/kyhistorypod. Welcome back to the Kentucky History Podcast. I'm your host, Jameson Cable, and we're going to continue our discussion with David Gambrel about Lincoln County during the Civil War.
And of course, keep in mind, we pay attention to it now, but we are a very geographically diverse county, and in the Civil War, that had a great impact on what side you were on. If the way you went south in Lincoln County was either through Hall's Gap, Chapel Gap, or Mason Gap. That was pretty much it, and so it wasn't let's get and go. And so the people who settled those areas were vastly different. The southern part of the county was almost exclusively pro-Union, and the northern part was almost exclusively pro-Southern.
Kind of a reverse there.
One real notable exception is Company C of the 6th Kentucky Confederate Cavalry. Contained men from the area where Lincoln, Rock Castle, and Pulaski counties meet. Dog Walk, what's Broughton now.
Yeah.
That whole area there, and there was a company of Confederate soldiers from that area. The only reasoning I can do is that one of the officers was a Dr. Alcorn from Somerset, and that might have been the draw there. In fact, the last Confederate soldier in Lincoln County was Robert Wesley Reynolds. They had the nickname of Uncle Bud, and he is buried at the Liberty Baptist Church Cemetery in Pulaski County, which is in northern Pulaski County. But his obituary says he's the last Confederate veteran buried, who passed. But there was a lot of skirmishing after Perryville. Before Perryville, Lincoln County plays a role in every bit of the battles in this area. And Lincoln Countyans were, two of the notable battles that Lincoln Countyans were connected with that would come to mind with the Battle of Stones River. Stones River was, a bitterly cold time of year, and a Severance from Crab Orchard died in the Battle at Stones River. He's buried behind the Crab Orchard Baptist Church, and that's noted on his tombstone. Mike Softly, who was from Wayne County but moved to Lincoln County after the war, was in the Battle of Stones River, and then the Battle of Shiloh. Mike Softly was in that.
Now,
well.
With Shiloh, where was Stone River? Where was that at? As far as
Stone River is in the vicinity of Lebanon, Tennessee, in that area.
Okay.
The first Cracker Barrel was. So it's in, I would say, the northern part of Middle Tennessee. Don't say Central Tennessee; it's Middle Tennessee. So there were a lot of Lincoln counties through the 3rd Kentucky Infantry, which had been organized in part south of Crab Orchard on Cruise Knob. Captain John Tuttle from Monticello, his Civil War diary, notes coming to south of Crab Orchard to join the Union Army. And then that book was still being printed a few years ago. That's an excellent read, and it has a lot of. So there was a big Lincoln County connection to Battle of Stones River, and Shiloh, and which was a tremendous bloodletting beyond our imagination. But Mike Salter was there, and on a personal note, my wife's great grandfather, who was from Madison County, Tennessee, who was the last Confederate veteran at a soldier at Perryville. He half of his unit was killed at Shiloh, and the other half pretty much at the Battle of Perryville. And he was ordered behind to take care of soldiers, and met a little dark-eyed girl and fell in love with her, and never rejoined this army. And I do have I think it'd be an interesting play. His name was Daniel Smith, and when President Wilson was trying to get the League of Nations treaty ratified, Daniel Smith shows up to the Harrodsburg Herald and tells his life story about how terrible the war was, and how the president's trying to avert future wars, and we need to get behind the president.
Wow.
I just thought that would make a good, because he tells us, I thought it'd make a good play, old man, newspaper office, and 1919, making and then doing a flashback story of his life, and he was an interesting, he was an interesting man. He became a school teacher and a quiet citizen after the war. When the Klan showed up at his house, assuming him being a Confederate soldier, former Confederate soldier, and would join right up with them, he sent them on their way. So he was an interesting man. But there was a lot of and the interesting thing is, at the Battle of Perryville, we had Lincoln County at the battle, and for Houstonville residents, I'm going to be giving a talk at 4:00 on June 24th at Houstonville Heritage Days about Logan Beecher Adams and Dr. Hawkins Brown, who fought against each other in the Civil War, but were pillars of the community in Houstonville after the Civil War, even put aside their political animosities for the betterment of the town, and they would have been on the battlefield against each other at the Battle of Perryville.
Wow.
Their units were, I don't know. Adams was a Confederate soldier, and sometimes those records aren't as complete because they became an army on the run.
Mm-hmm.
That I've pieced together a few. If you read Basil Duke's history, Basil Duke was Confederate General John Hunt Morgan's brother-in-law, and after Morgan's death became the commander of Morgan's men.
Mm-hmm.
And he mentions at the end of the war, after Appomattox, when Jefferson Davis is fleeing the state, or fleeing, trying to flee south, that they meet up with Colonel Napier and 50 of his men. Colonel Napier being county judge in Lincoln County at the start of the war, and resigned, become adjutant for the Orphan Brigade, and then became lieutenant colonel in the 6th Kentucky Confederate Cavalry. He escaped capture on Morgan's raid, and he and about 50 of his men, who were still combatants after Appomattox, were Jefferson Davis's bodyguard, and didn't surrender until the middle of May 1865 in Marietta, Georgia.
Wow. And those are Lincoln County boys.
Yeah. And it's Thomas Napier in 1869 became the only sheriff in the history of Lincoln County killed in the line of duty. Probably had to do with the Civil War. The guy that killed him was from a pro-union family.
Oh yeah.
And that's I could do a whole talk on that for another day. Sheriff Napier after the war came back, set up a county poorhouse. That was there wasn't any sort of government aid in those days, and the economy of Kentucky was devastated by the Civil War.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
And so he helped to reach out to those that had been impoverished by that. And interesting, he was killed in 1869, 1867, James Bridgewater, who by all indications was an abolitionist. He was associated with, James Bridgewater became an agent for the Freedmen's Bureau. The Freedmen's Bureau was designed to protect the rights of the former slaves. And there was a lot of resentment toward the former slaves in Kentucky. Simply, as I mentioned earlier, Kentucky slaveholders have been promised reparations. And the regulators, which were the basis of what we would call the Ku Klux Klan, were terrorizing. And James Bridgewater, who turned in a list in May of 1867, he went to Louisville and turned in a list of these regulators to federal authorities. And he told them, this is going to make me a marked man. They're going to kill me. And he kept asking for aid that never came. And he was killed in 1867 in downtown Stanford. And by the Crab Orchard Gang, so to speak. And the guy that killed him after Napier is assassinated becomes the sheriff.
Wow.
Kind of don't smell too good.
No, that does not seem to go too well.
Napier and Bridgewater were the key figures of the Civil War in Lincoln County, and they were Lodge brothers, and extraordinary thing. In the fall of September 11th, 1861, at the Masonic Lodge meeting in Stanford, Thomas Napier, a Confederate officer, is present. If you know anything about the Masonic Lodge, you heard the term being blackballed. It takes a unanimous vote to join the Masonic Lodge. Everyone who's there has to vote. If you're there, you have to vote. You can't say, excuse me. You have to vote, and everyone has to vote to allow this person to join. And so Thomas Napier who was a Confederate officer, allowed James Bridgewater, who was a federal officer, to join his lodge.
Wow. And
there were Harb King Jr., who was a captain in the Union Army, was there that night too. So it's kind of incredible. But these two men were the central figures, and it's kind of interesting. After they're both killed, who rises to power? One of the stops on my tour at Crab Orchard is Walter Saunders, who was this guy that killed Bridgewater. And I trying to remember the exact quote, but I think he actually was killed later on. His younger brother got into it with the town marshal in Richmond, and he went over to straighten him out, and he got killed in Richmond. And he got elected sheriff for killing a man. And the newspaper at the time said, despite his desperate qualities, he was a good man. But his tombstone said something to the effect, loving husband, affectionate father, and a friend to all. I would think there were those who would disagree with that. But one thing I always caution people in studying this era is you can't possibly apply 21st century values and mores to the people of that era. It just, and especially to wartime. War can change, very ordinary folks into, was William Anderson, who was called Bloody Bill Anderson,
Mm-hmm.
and he was a vicious killer.
Yeah.
But if you look, they captured his womenfolk and put them in jail, and the jail collapsed and killed them.
Yeah.
And then he went berserk.
Yeah.
And it's easy to say, well, he was a cold-blooded killer. Well, you put my wife and my mom in jail, and they died
Oh,
while there. I don't know what that might trigger in me.
yeah.
And,
Yeah.
and we have plenty of that, in Crab Orchard, Harb King Jr. and his teenage sons, and about a dozen other young men from western Rock Castle and eastern Lincoln County, Kentucky, were lynched by the Confederate cavalry at Pineville.
Wow.
And one of King's brothers went and retrieved their bodies, and he killed some Confederate stragglers in retaliation.
Mm-hmm.
At the same time, James Harris went to house on Lancaster Street there in Crab Orchard and killed Dr. Joseph Bell and James M. Reed. James M. Reed had been wounded at the Battle of Perryville. There became a lot of personal bloodletting. It really was the dogs of war were turned loose. It's amazing that we have a semblance of unity after going
After
through
all that, yeah. Well, like you bring up the point of how to assess and look at how they why they did it or whatever. And oftentimes I feel like people get really connected to the Civil War for whatever reason. But like people who they want to say, well, my grandpa or my ancestor was for the South, or fought for the South, or fought for the Union, or whatever, and that they get connected to that. And then people might loop that in. Oh, well, that they stood for all the everything that the South stood for, or stood for everything the North stood for. But really, like some of these stories that you just pointed out, it might have just been very simple, as in these people did something to them. Those people were for the South, so I'm going to go join the North and fight against them.
Well, it's not as simple as the narrative, and I'll give you a prime example. I mentioned the Softly family. Dear sweet lady, George Softly's late wife was Sue Softly, and a few years before she passed, she brought me a photograph of her great grandmother's brother's military tombstone in what appeared to be a national, military cemetery. His name was Joseph Overall, and she said, "David, I'd like to go visit this grave. This is my great grandmother's brother. He fought in the war. I'd like to go visit his grave. Could you think you could find it for me?" And I set out on a search to do that, and Sue passed away, and I never located while she was living. And a few years afterwards, my memory is jogged, and I said, "Well, I know do her no benefit, but I want to look again, because there's a thing called Find a Grave that exploded on the internet." And of course, I caution people, there's some really bad research out there on Find a Grave. Don't use it as a primary source.
Yeah.
It did help me. I did finally find Joseph Overall's grave, and the reason I hadn't located it earlier is because he had moved to Los Angeles, California, and that's where he was buried. So when I found his Find a Grave monument, the Find a Grave memorial says this is the third great uncle of Barack Obama.
Whoa.
And Barack Obama's third great grandmother and Sue Softly's great grandmother were sisters, and they were sisters to Joseph Overall. In the Union Army.
Yeah.
Of George Washington Overall. This is of Nelson County.
Yeah.
And George Washington Overall and the Overall family were slaveholders. So Barack Obama is the direct descendant of Union sympathizing slaveholders.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, wow. That we know. And so, if we try to fight the Civil War over again, we take all the fun out of the history of it. And we we can't,
Yeah.
we can't do that. And I just suffice it to say, and actually in my tour, what Mike softly said when they dedicated the Confederate Memorial was,
Mhm.
um, we need to come together as countrymen, and let a curse be on anyone who would stir the embers of war ever again. And of course, I would love to say that everyone heeded his voice, but that wasn't the case at all.
Yeah.
Pretty much after in 1871, they reheated the Civil War. Jack King, the brother of Harb King Jr., who had actually betrayed him and caused him to get captured in his teenage boys, and his wife divorced him, stating that he had abandoned them for Civil War service, and he said, "No, I didn't. You supported me in this. Evidence that you came to Chicago to see me at Camp Douglas," which is true. I've got Dr. Pettis' letter that says Mrs. Jack King was in camp today, and then they also expelled Jack King from his Masonic lodge at the same time. And by the way, Jack King is the direct ancestor of Sandy Overley, who was a nominee for lieutenant governor a few years ago. And at the same time, on the other side of it, they brought murder charges against Jim Harris for the killing of Dr. Bell and James M. Reed. After the Harris family lost everything they had in defending him, they basically said, "Never mind, it was an act of war." So.
Oh wow.
So I would, I love history, but we don't honor the Confederates or the Union soldiers by trying to fight the war over again.
Yeah.
That
Very
wasn't
true.
what they desired. That wasn't what they desired.
Yeah.
We have a very, very rich heritage.
Yeah.
And
Very
I
true.
honor that. And I'll let, as I, my pastor, I'm a pastor too, and my adage is, God put me in sales, not accounting.
There you go. That's very good. Oh, so so Barack Obama is related or has ancestry ties to
Nelson County, yes,
Nelson
George
County.
Washington overall, and that's not
Gotcha.
that's not I have no interest in. I love history. I don't have any interest in and making that a political statement. That's the
Yeah.
reality.
Well, that's just that
Enslaved
just
and
blows me away.
and
Uh,
yeah, it is a very interesting twist of things.
mhm.
And not everyone. Primary evidence is, um, Colonel Wolford, Frank Wolford, commander of the 1st Kentucky Union Cavalry, was actually arrested for making. We understand the elections, presidential elections, you didn't, on the ballot were not the names of the candidates for president, but their electors, members of the electoral college.
Yeah. Yeah.
And Frank Wolford was arrested by President Lincoln for giving a speech for an elector from McClellan in the 1864 election. Now, President Lincoln saw the bad politics of that immediately and released him.
Mhm.
But Wolford's big problem was the recruitment of African Americans and making the war about slavery. He had a real issue of with that. And Frank Wolford is, if you've not read much about him, he's a lot of Lincoln County men served under him. And there's his grandnephew, Ron Wolford Blair, has written a book about Colonel Wolford very recently. And then after the war, The Wild Riders of Kentucky 1st Kentucky Cavalry was written by Guy and Liberty, and that's been reprinted a few times, and it's a wealth of information about local participants in the Civil War.
I always have to ask this because when you're talking about Civil War, you bring up Morgan's Raiders and all that kind of stuff, and typically when you start looking into the things they did, oftentimes they burnt down courthouses and so forth. However, Lincoln County survived that.
Right.
Um, what was the Morgan's Raiders as far as in Lincoln County? They come, show
Oh,
up.
yes. And my tour tells this. I think what really set it up was, as prior to the Civil War, Morgan was a captain of a militia group in Lexington called the Lexington Rifles. And they came in the 1850s and paraded at the Crab Orchard Springs.
Everything
And,
happens at the
and,
Crab Orchard Springs.
and in fact, the hats that there's some of the stuff they wore is on file at the Kentucky Military History Museum. They had these very gaudy green and white uniforms, and so you imagine you're 11, 12 years old and you see this kind of thing. This is how that affects you as a preteen. And then in the summer of 1862, Morgan comes through Crab Orchard. And in fact, at Crab Orchard Baptist Church, there's a historic marker.
The marker, yeah.
And they burned George Ellsworth tries to capture Harb King, and unsuccessfully tries to capture him. And so they come through eastern Lincoln County, go down through Woodstock on to Somerset, and then Morgan, as part of Bragg's invasion of Kentucky, comes back in through Middle Tennessee, up through Liberty, is almost killed at Liberty. And when they get to Houstonville, I don't know who owned the farm, had been subdivided, but L.C. Butcher had one time owned the farm as a huge farm out on 78. They camped there and got news of the Battle of Richmond, which was one of the most lopsided Confederate victories, and is celebrated all night. Morgan goes into Lexington and sends recruiters back. And in Lincoln County on Danville Avenue at what's now the Hill House, they recruited there, recruited in Lancaster, recruited in Danville, and those men were put into the 6th Kentucky Confederate Cavalry, and they were commanded by our county judge, resigned, Thomas Napier, become lieutenant colonel of that. After the war, the adjutant for the 6th Kentucky, James Walker Alcorn, came back and built that house there. That's the Hill House. It's the Walker House, or the Alcorn House. On commemoration, this is where he was mustered in the Confederate Cavalry. And so these men, they didn't get to take part in the Battle of Perryville, but they were mustered in September of 1862. And they were part of Bragg's retreat. And then they were a lot of Lincoln County men, primarily Company B under Captain Thomas Shanks, who was connected up to William Whitley. William Whitley's great grandson, Stephen Birch, was among these Lincoln Countyans that were in that, and they were on part of the Indiana-Ohio raid, and they had their neighbors chasing them, and in fact, in one of the famous episodes, one of the letters I have from Dr. Pettis, they're asking about a watch that was taken from them when they were captured. And they say, and the last time we saw the watch, it was in possession of Will Severance, who was another Crab Orchard fellow.
Mm.
So some of these Lincoln County men under Morgan's Raiders, Morgan was captured, put in prison. He managed to escape with a vow that he would never be captured again. And of course, his Indiana and Ohio raid, the plan was to meet with. He went further north actually than Robert E. Lee did. But the plan was to meet Robert E. Lee in Gettysburg.
Oh yeah! Wow.
and of course they were captured primarily at Battle of Buffington Island. And one of the reasons Joe Grimes told me his uncle that Morgan was so beloved is Morgan could have escaped capture. He, these men rode the best bluegrass thoroughbreds they had. I mean, and they were experienced horsemen. And he was in the middle of the river, his horse swimming strong, and beheld most of his army back on the bank in Ohio, and he refused to leave his men and went back, and he was captured. Incidentally, was put up in a hotel by Casey County and Frank Wolford. Basically, Morgan and his officers were treated to the finest liquor and set their boots out to be shined and all that at a hotel at his enemy's expense. Kind of a interesting story about the code of officers in those days. And a lot of those men never rejoined after that. But then after Morgan, the next year in Greenville, Tennessee, he was sleeping separate from his men in a private residence and was killed. He was ordered to surrender and didn't, and was shot and killed in Greenville, Tennessee. And after that, his brother-in-law Basil Duke took command, and so there were Lincoln Countyans with Morgan's men to the very end. And that, and Mike Softly and several men after the war, the Morgan's Men Association formed, and they were the movers, shakers of politics in Kentucky. And in fact, there's, Mike Softly was appointed territorial governor, I think, in Wyoming after the war, and was circuit judge and was on track to become governor when he died. And so Morgan's Men became very politically prominent.
Involved. Yeah.
We're going to stop right there and thank David for coming on the show again and talking about Lincoln County during the Civil War. Thank you all for listening, and we'll see you next time. Welcome to the Kentucky History Channel, where we strive to bring you all the Kentucky history content you want and you deserve. Kentucky is a part of all of us, and we plan on covering all the history we can, from Pike County to Fulton County, from Louisville to Harlan. Here on our YouTube channel, you can find many videos dedicated to different events, people, governors, and places in Kentucky. There's something for everybody. While you're here, if you like the channel, hit the subscribe button and the notification button so you get notified anytime new Kentucky history is available. And if you want to support the channel, we have a Patreon page as well, or patreon.com/KYHistoryPod. You've probably heard about Daniel Boone, but what about the rest of the frontiersmen who came to Kentucky and settled? That's what we want to bring to the Kentucky History Channel. The stories of the untold, the stories of those forgotten. One thing to expect on our channel is great Kentucky content. Some stories that you've never heard of. The Night Riders, who began in western Kentucky. Bloody Monday, the riots in Louisville. The assassination of Governor Goebel, the only governor ever assassinated in the United States. Stories from all over Kentucky, stories that are unforgettable once you've heard them. You can find out who counties in Kentucky are named after and how your county got started. From beginning to end, we plan to document every county in Kentucky, all 120. Reach out to us on all of our social media platforms. Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And also leave a comment on one of our YouTube videos. You can also check out our podcast episodes. You can subscribe to our podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and many more. We're always seeking to find more Kentucky history so we can bring it to you. the viewers, the listeners, we want all the stories and all the events from Kentucky's great history to be told and shared everywhere.